Welcome to Myth Informed. I'm your host, Brian Edward, and today, across from me, I have Lucas Lynch, who's commissioning editor at Aereo Magazine, formerly at Conatus News, which I linked to, but I don't know much about them. He writes often about secularism, politics, culture, and more. He's culturally Jewish, religiously secular, and Lucas, welcome to the woke crusades of 2020. Are you going to be our Saladin?
Um, you know, in the future, now, whenever they want to bring up in an argument about how terrible Europeans were, they say, but the Crusades will be, but the woke Crusades. I don't think I'm going to join that army, though. I think I'm part of the army that's currently getting crushed.
Right. Yeah. I know that's what I need. Like we're on the other side, and that's the thing. The Saladin has to rout the Crusaders, and right now we don't have our Saladin. I'm not sure if Donald Trump is providing the leadership we need or not. But at the same time, I worry about Joe Biden. One of the things that concerns me are like soccer players losing their job over what their wife tweeted on social media.
Yeah, so, that in and of itself is not a threat to civilization, but it's part of a bigger trend. It's just becoming part of a bigger trend. And of course, now we're all quarantined and stuck at home, and many people are unemployed. And social media now has just become a cesspool. It's becoming everyone is out for everybody else on this righteous crusade. Of course, what's really funny is people I knew growing up who were among the most homophobic people I knew.
I think it may have lagged here a little bit.
To report to a junior editor before he can have his columns published. We're really seeing an acceleration of things that people said, oh, it's just in the universities, it's just kids, it's no big deal. But those kids are now growing up and taking over the institutions.
Right. And it seem like when you give credence to this at the university, at an institution, and you say, yeah, it's okay, like you would expect this to spread. Ideas aren't in a vacuum. If there's a show that's super, super popular, like, I don't know, Will and Grace, for example, it did a lot to reduce homophobia throughout the country, and I think did probably more to usher in gay marriage than any of the activism did.
I don't know how I feel about that. I feel like oftentimes that stuff is a little overstated. Not that Will and Grace wasn't great for doing what it did, but
Now we're lagging again.
A group or the success of a cause. Just think about, the groups doing the best in the United States right now are South Asians and East Asians, and the portrayals of them in the media up until just recently, there were virtually none, and yet they were already doing incredibly well. This whole idea that, you need to see it on the screen before it becomes normalized. I don't know. I don't think it's that simple. A lot of groups are succeeding regardless. They would like to see themselves on screen, and it would be great for them to be on screen. But is that really what's moving progress forward, or is one following the other? I worry about this somewhat. A couple of years ago, there was that whole thing about they were saying that the Oscars had only white people, and then they did studies and found that in terms of Oscar winners, African Americans were about exactly represented relative to their size of the population. And the people who were really missing were Hispanics, East Asians, and South Asians. And South Asians and South But, it was Will and Grace really the thing that moved it forward? I don't know. I think it was a little bit of both.
Yeah. So I don't mean as far as like, I think that there were gay people succeeding at very, very high levels prior to all this. What I mean is that it reduced the bigotry. I think that even despite bigotry, like people can get ahead, right? Now, ideally, you do want to lower that bigotry. So I think that's what it was doing. It was more of a cultural acceptance. Ideally, you're right. You should have the activism. You want legal acceptance. The same thing, like slaves were freed, they were allowed to vote. But it took a lot longer for the cultural acceptance of black people as equals.
Right. And I don't want to discount it totally, but I think it's more complex. I mean, a lot of these new culture warriors plenty of good things happen with no representation at all. some things there's tons of representation and not that much progress. You
Yeah.
know, the South Side of Chicago just had, unfortunately, one of the deadliest weekends in something like 20 years. And we have all these black candidates for office. We have all these award-winning African-American movies, which is great. It's all great. But the question is, what really helps ordinary people? What helps people? Again, it's great that there's great talent of all walks of life that are winning awards. But is that really helping ordinary people where they really live? It's complex.
No.
I feel bad because I don't want to give the impression that I think Will and Grace did nothing. I think it did. But in the 90s when that was going on, it was the Clintons helping to scuttle gay marriage at the same time. So it's a little bit of a wash.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a wash.
Yeah, I think that,
I don't
go on. Yeah, the attitudes themselves, I guess it's the importance of attitudes. I think both are necessary, but you're right. You can't, attitudes aren't everything, and the politics aren't everything.
Sorry about the connection here.
Yeah.
But the problem is that now they think that we need to turn newspapers into propaganda factories, and we're seeing problems with that. I mean, there was this whole scandal at the New York Times with the Tom Cotton op-ed, and regardless of how you feel about that, I mean, I can understand why people would be worried about, send in the troops. I mean, this is every libertarian nightmare, right? The president of the United States is using tyrannical powers potentially. But should people know what U.S. senators are thinking? People that have the power to make decisions on their lives, should they not have access to the paper of record? And I think the opinion editor was fired because of that.
Yeah, that he was put down. So the article in my understanding, that Tom Cotton wrote was a defense of the military being used in cases where the police and or the National Guard were insufficient to keep order. And I think he cited the 1992 Rodney King riots, and where the U.S. military, I think, was brought in. And that said that this is, I don't think he said we need to bring in the military, but it's at least justified.
Right. And again, that's something that people can be on all ends of the spectrum about. But is it really right to silence the paper of record if they just happen to let that person speak? And that's where the trends are getting more worrying. I mean, we're having more and more papers that really did have a commitment, at least in the past, to having some kind of journalistic integrity, just willingly being turned into propaganda mills by its younger employees.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw what Barry Weiss was tweeting about this earlier this week. How there's a war, both in newsrooms and everywhere else, between the older liberals and the younger, what's the word? I mean, the younger Maoists. I mean, maybe that's too harsh, but. The future holds, because if we can't talk honestly about these things, we're not going to solve the problem.
Yeah, I agree. And somebody in there, and I'm not sure who to attribute this quote to, said that the slogan, all the news that's fit to print, there's two different camps. One that are basing their thought on all, and the other that's part on fit. And I think, it's the woke crowd, that's newer crowd that's worried about whether that's fit to print, versus the other crowd that wants to at least try to give more opinions, a conservative opinion, at least some of the time. Obviously, we know that this editorial leans left. But to their credit, they will publish conservative take every now and then.
Or will they now, because this guy's been sacked? That's the question.
Yeah.
Who knows what's going to happen now? But what's going to happen? I mean, Tom Cotton still votes to authorize this, and now people on the East Coast just don't know, and they don't even consider what's going into it. That doesn't benefit anybody.
No, it doesn't. Right. And that's why I think it's okay to print that. Like Steve King, for example, in the rep from Iowa. He just got primaried now. Many Republicans were upset with what he was saying. But in order to primary him out, you need to know what he's saying.
Oh, yeah. And this, again, goes against what people think deplatforming is going to accomplish. I mean, Steve King totally hung himself by his own words. And, same thing with long forgotten Milo Yiannopoulos. Anyone remember him? I mean, it's because people let him open his mouth that he's gone now. When people think they're going to defeat people by just charging them off the page, oftentimes it's their own words that do them in.
Right.
I mean, I got to give the Republican Party credit for getting rid of Steve King. And once this stuff came out, when he was talking about white nationalist sort of talking points, I mean, the Republican Party did everything they could to isolate him very quickly. I don't know if the Democratic Party really did that with its own people, with their own record of really, truly troubling things. I mean, I'm not talking about, oh, someone made an offensive joke. I mean, I
Right.
know where we all stand on that, but David Duke called Ilhan Omar the most important member of Congress. I mean, that's a problem.
Yeah, it is. I know.
Yeah.
And then instead of condemning anti-Semitism, they go ahead and broadly condemn all kinds of racism. It seems weird because we do have the Biden camp, and Sean and I, our president was debating, and I was afraid that Biden would be under so much pressure for the George Floyd protests to come out and either dismiss or condone the looting. That this is just a welling up of pain that is hundreds of years in the making, and that in some ways it was justified. Now, he didn't do that, but I wonder when they keep giving ground, like at what point does the dam overflow?
Well, and I have to give Biden a lot of credit. Biden has proven a lot smarter over the course of this entire race than I thought he would be. And thus far, either he sort of stayed quiet, and of course his handlers want him to stay quiet because they don't want him to say something stupid, or when Trump has tried to bait him, he's reacted the right way. And actually, the entire leadership reacted the right way. Well, except for maybe the kneeling thing. That was a little bit much. But in terms of, do you condone the looting? And more than that, do you condone defunding the police? They've all come out very strongly and said no. The Congressional Black Caucus has said no. I think it was Joe Manchin of West Virginia said, only someone who's truly nuts would say that. But of course, who had to chime in? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez saying like, well, but let's be nice to the activists saying this, and again, it's why these people were just a noose around everybody's neck in terms of trying to win this election. But fortunately, the people in charge are adults, and they realize that.
Do you think there's a problem with language? Like defund the police? Like I commented this on Twitter, and what I immediately get back from certain quarters is that's not what it means. Defund the police is not taking all the money and canceling the police department. What it really means is, and then I'm given this broad piece that sometimes it means taking part of the money and giving it to programs to help communities that are underprivileged. Sometimes it's, just a reworking of the police department like Camden did, and getting rid of the police unions and putting in different police. But why that term, that it's so amorphous, but yet they want to use it. And it feels like, to me, that this is part of a larger strategy, in the same way that what we used to call maybe somebody being insensitive is now white supremacy.
The thing is, there are people who really believe that slogan. People I know that really say, no, let's defund them. It's going to be great. Just do community policing. Again, I think Chicago this weekend showed just how bad that could get.
Yeah.
It is gaslighting to a certain extent. If you want to reform the police, just say that. If you want to do community policing, just say that. There's a great expression, the Mott and Bailey fallacy, which is that you say something that's hyperbolic, and then when people react, say, no, what it always really meant was this, which no one's buying. And the voters aren't going to buy it, if only because voters overall aren't sophisticated enough to tease out the language. Trump did this all the time. I mean, Trump would say, we're going to ban all Muslims. Well, no, we're going to ban them from some countries. Don't you want to ban the radical people from these countries? Of course, the countries that were on the ban had never sent a terrorist, and there were all kinds of countries that weren't on the ban. So, and to be fair, maybe it's a rhetorical thing that works. I mean, the more I'm thinking about it, I mean, Trump is the president, right? So, is there something to this hyperbole? Maybe. But as one friend of mine put it, why not just put the election, put a bow on it, and just hand it to him with a slogan like that?
This one seems weird to me. But when you do use it, and you're supposed to say, well, defund the police, even though I actually mean community policing or something else, right? Or reorganize the police or get rid of qualified immunity, something like that. The fact that you're saying defund the police, like 5 years later, they can turn around and say, well, look at all this broad bipartisan support for defunding the police, and now use it literally.
Right. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I think, as Melissa Chen said the other day, that Minneapolis is going to be one of these laboratories. Mm-hmm. It's, willingly or not. If I had money to invest, would I invest in gun shops in Minneapolis? Absolutely. I think they're going to see sales soar, at least initially, but maybe it will work. I don't know. I have a feeling probably not. But there is something to be said about qualified immunity. There is something to be said about police unions. I generally support unions, but I do see that unions sometimes serve the employees that really shouldn't be there. There's a balance to be had. There definitely are incompetent people that get to stay. And in other professions, the incompetent person drags everybody down, but nobody dies.
Yeah.
So where will it end up? Probably some kind of reform. It's going to be interesting to see if Joe Biden can be that person, given that Joe Biden was one of the people that helped give the police all these tools, that helped militarize the police.
Yeah.
One thing that I find interesting, I don't know if you saw the series Waco on Netflix recently.
I'm familiar with Waco, but I didn't see the series.
It's really fascinating because we forget in the mid-90s, this was the rhetoric of the sort of white militia movements, too, about this militarized police force that was going after its own citizens. People were saying about how the government treated people at Ruby Ridge and at Waco, regardless of how you feel about David Koresh, right? There's no doubt that David Koresh was a pedophile, that he manipulated his followers. But did all those children deserve to die as a result? Absolutely not. I don't know as much about Ruby Ridge. These definitely are people perhaps living in a way I would never live and that maybe we should condemn. But the question is, does the government have the right to just execute them? So it is interesting to look back on that and see much of the same rhetoric coming back 20 some odd years later. And now it's this righteous thing because a lot of people looking back on Ruby Ridge and Waco, they say, oh, those people got what they deserved because they were a bunch of right-wing kooks anyway. And it's not that different from people who say, you know, well, what were these African-American suspects doing? What did they do to bring this upon themselves? When in reality, suppose George Floyd was counterfeiting. He didn't deserve to die that way. Suppose, you know, and what did Breonna Taylor do? Breonna Taylor was just sleeping.
Right.
So, and that's really I have to say that's the one amount of balance we have to strike is that a lot of these people really have died in outrageous ways. And the good news, actually, it doesn't feel like it. There's huge bipartisan consensus that this is an outrage. I mean, even Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh think that this was an outrage. Did you see when Rush Limbaugh went on the Breakfast Club to discuss this?
Yeah. That he was pretty good, and he was open-minded about it. He actually wanted to get Charlemagne's position.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the sad thing about, you know, the schism between the protests and the looting and all the rest, because it could have been this moment of bipartisan consensus. Of course, we don't have someone in the White House that can make that happen, but you know, that's the other thing is seeing a lot of these sort of well-educated white people that I went to school with cheering on the looting, because of course it's not happening in their neighborhood.
Right. It's
not happening to people that they know. And it's fun. What is this going to do to the neighborhood? And it's really the progressive white people that are just cheering, and anyone who questions it, they sort of want, who do you work for? Where's your job? Can we get you fired? That's what I'm seeing anyway.
Yeah. And there's no doubt that like the way he died, that this was there. I think it was like somebody watching an ISIS video for the first time. I've seen ISIS videos, the slow and deliberate death. It really is harrowing. It provokes a deep emotional response. You know, I've been there, and I can see why, especially people not accustomed to looking at something like that, might get really bothered. But you do see, you know, like things like Tony Timpa in Dallas dies in a white guy in almost the same way, except for the officers kneeling on his back, suffocates them. They mock him while they do it. He's begging for his life. He dies. Cops not punished, completely got off. And there's other examples, like Daniel Shaver killed while lying down. Dylan Noble killed at a routine traffic stop for walking out. And I think is, why not just, there would be broad bipartisan support if we just deracialized it. Even, let's say somebody says, well, per capita, this is happening to black people more. Okay, granted, fine. But shouldn't we help everyone that is getting harmed by this? I don't understand why we can't deracialize this and move forward.
Well, we have to be careful, though. Remember, we were talking earlier about Ilhan Omar and anti-Semitism and how they sort of passed a all racism is bad measure. I mean, I think it's okay in the moment to focus on the fact that if it does happen disproportionately to African Americans, we should acknowledge that. If it also happens to white defendants, fine. I mean, that's also terrible. And you're right. There is there is a danger, I think, in, and of course the problem with this other person is most of us hadn't even heard about it. So there are some people who say, well, why are you bringing this up? What's your agenda? Well, I mean, part of it was just that it didn't get any media coverage, and it's terrible that it happened to him. There are some people using it disingenuously to try and mask the problem entirely. But I think the real problem was with the looting. I think that's where the support started to peel off. And the danger for Democrats is that rioting tends to make people vote more conservative. The 68 riots at the Democratic National Convention absolutely helped push things towards Nixon. There were other reasons for that, too. But if we really want to get these reforms enacted, we have to hold on to power. And sort of being the sort of holier than thou reactionaries, is that going to help? Now, some of them claim absolutely fervently that it Confederate paraphernalia. Why should there be Confederate paraphernalia on a military base? They're the biggest traitors to the country, and it's sort of curious that people in the military would hold on to this stuff. Now, is that mostly symbolic? Maybe, but it's good if we're starting to question that.
Yeah.
I'm a little more divided on the monuments, even though Confederate monuments, as far as I'm concerned, shouldn't exist. But now they're attacking Churchill. They're attacking Abraham Lincoln. That's where they start to lose me. Abraham Lincoln, really? In Boston, they attacked a monument to the U.S. The 54th Regiment. It was an all-black regiment that I believe was portrayed in the movie Glory.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah. So this is an all-black regiment that fought in the Civil War, and they defaced their monument as well. I mean, what does that accomplish?
I can't even get at it. I can at least maybe get at what they're mad about with Lincoln, that he didn't immediately move to emancipation. He was trying to just unify the country, and therefore he wasn't woke enough or whatever. But I can't. What's their beef with the black soldiers?
Right. And some people have said they didn't even know what the monument was about. In Colorado, there was a monument to the Armenian genocide that was defaced. Again, they may have not even known what that was. But if this was a bunch of white supremacists doing it, would we give them that much charity? Probably not.
No, we wouldn't.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah, the defacing, all of that. Yeah, it's when you see the job loss is weird. Again, there's somebody that now a teacher who retweeted or replied to one of Donald Trump's tweets, and kind of with almost like a MAGA support kind of thing. Now placed on leave, and there's going to be a school board investigation. I mean, this is going to rile people up. And what the fear is, and what I'm not sure if the woke left gets, is if this gets shut down and you rattle people up enough, we might actually get the existence of real right-wing parties, not the right wing that we get accused of, but actual reactionary right-wing parties like in Europe. And they might get significant, at least in Europe, that could easily happen. And I'm quoting a little bit from the guys from Trigonometry here, that he had a thread, and that's what he's saying is, if we keep getting gaslit, that you're actually going to see a tremendous backlash to some of this, because the only ones going to stand up are the actual white supremacists, because they have one or two like freedom ideas and a whole bunch of crap behind it. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't think it's going to be actual white supremacists. I think it just could help this populist movement. I mean, sort of like what you saw with Boris Johnson in the UK. I mean, having Jeremy Corbyn was the best gift he could ever have. But Boris Johnson is not a white supremacist. I think.
No, of course not.
You could have these Steve Bannon types that, economic populism. But the actual white supremacists have been sort of deflated. And actually, a lot of them are very disappointed with Donald Trump. I remember seeing Richard Spencer being outraged that Donald Trump killed that Iranian general.
Really?
Things like, yeah, because he said, why are we getting one of these weird things, right? This is what the left was calling for years, get out of foreign military affairs. He was absolutely outraged that Trump killed that general and wasn't focusing more on things at home. I don't know what the word on the street is with them with regards to the coronavirus and all of that stuff. But I think it could help him. Absolutely. I think even though his approval ratings are slipping, if people see the Democrats as the parties of these radicals supporting the looting, that absolutely could push some people that would otherwise have been on the fence.
Yeah. So that's interesting. And right now we have a two-party system in the United States. So again, the rise of some far-right party from a couple percent to 10% may impact Europe, but it's not really going to affect us as much.
Yeah, well, I mean, in Europe is, I think in some ways, for example, Hungary now basically has a de facto dictator. I mean, I think they've gone all the way. I don't see that being a big danger here, frankly. But people who are super rosy about Biden's election and it's a sure thing, I am just worried. It just sounds too familiar.
Yeah.
But he's not making the same mistakes that Hillary Clinton did. He's not going all in on identity politics. It's going to be interesting to see who he picks as vice president. In the wake of all this, I thought it was going to be Amy Klobuchar, but Amy Klobuchar failed to charge the officer involved in the killing when she was in Minnesota. So, yep. And whether or not that was correct at the time, she's dead on arrival. So it's going to be interesting to see who he ends up picking.
Yeah, that's some like dog crap that's not going to stop stinking. Part of this is this overreaction. Is I feel there's an idiom out there that I heard that says, like, don't oppress paranoid people. I think this is true for what you mentioned at Waco. Like, don't just immediately come after them. Like, it seems like the Alex Jones types. Like, again, being oppressed. There's a lot of kooks out there that watch Alex Jones. Some people watch him for comedy. But the more and more you do shut that kind of thing down, the more and more these people are going to get really scared and weird. And then bad things happen because we're a gun culture.
Right.
So the same thing would be. I would say the left version of the equivalent of that would be if some very right-wing president wanted to say, let's deport all illegals now, today. We're going to start. That would be chaos. And people would die.
Well, it's sort of, we had a little taste of it early in his first year when people stormed JFK Airport. I mean, it was really interesting, and I'm not even saying that was a bad thing. But absolutely, and I mean, absolutely, that's what's happening right now with parties on the left. That think fascism has arrived. I think something bad has arrived. I don't think it's quite there. As someone put it, if there's one good thing about Donald Trump not really believing in anything, it's that he's not someone willing to die for the cause. He will sort of float whichever way benefits him. He's not a true believer. I mean, this is one of the things when impeachment was going on. People said, oh, we can't wait to impeach him. But then you get Mike Pence in office. He's even worse because he really believes in something. He really, really believes in something.
Well, does he? I mean, like Tucker Carlson went off a few days ago. He picked on everyone, all of the left, right, for a lot of the crazy woke shit. But then went after Nikki Haley, went after Vice President Mike Pence, for essentially condoning this, and essentially saying, yes, we've got to deal with this systemic racism. That we have to deal with systemic racism. All these Republicans were supporting that. Like, there's a big question on whether systemic racism is real or if this is just a narrative. And that's what I'm concerned about. I don't want to concede that language. Like, I want to reform police in where we need to. But I don't want to say it's because we're systemically racist, because I don't believe we are.
Yeah, probably the more accurate version is we are systemically racist to a degree. The question is, how big does that degree go? And I think the narrative likes to act as though we're living in the Jim Crow South now, and that's not true. I feel like we can all take a page from Steven Pinker here, which is to say, let's look at the data and let's see, if we were doctors diagnosing something, let's suppose you have a patient with a tumor and the tumor is 1 centimeter wide. Well, if you pretend it's 10 centimeters wide, you're not going to get a pat on the back as a surgeon. And if you treat the patient as if it's bigger than it is and you give them a treatment that's dangerous to them that they didn't need, you'll be drummed out of the profession. But for some reason, when it comes to politics, if you use as much hyperbole as possible, you're rewarded. So it's one of these things where I think it's undeniable that there is some systemic racism, but I mean, you compare us to almost any other country, one of the least racist countries on earth. That being said, why is that true? It's because when we see a problem, we talk about it and we fix it. So there's something to be said for, there is something to be said for African Americans having experiences with the police that white people don't typically have to the same degree, although some do. We can be honest about to what degree that is. And to the extent that someone like Tony Timpa dies, we should reform that too.
Yeah.
I do, there is something to be said for, we definitely should tone down the hyperbole. We should hold activists accountable. We should use data to say, well, is it really this bad or is it really this bad? And our are the solutions going to work? That's the other thing, because there's a lot of rhetoric about what's going to work, and oftentimes when people get what they want, and it does improve things, absolutely, and yet a lot of the disparities are still there. That, to me, that's the really interesting question, is trying to figure out to what extent some groups succeed and others don't. To what degree is it the villain that we think it is? And again, this is where I think Steven Pinker's approach is really important. One of the quotes in Enlightenment Now that really changed me was, he said, we have to approach this with the skepticism and the sort of the surgical ability of an engineer or a doctor, not with the hyperbole of a demagogue. Another way he put it was, you're not going to solve this through divine revelation or dialectical struggle, in terms of really solving the problem.
Yeah.
You know, and police departments have had all kinds of very data-driven ways to solve the problem. Until recently, the rate in Chicago was going down because they could target individual blocks, and they knew sort of at what time of year and So I really believe we need a data-driven approach to this. I think that's the real problem. But I think the data-driven approach is going to reveal that there is some systemic racism that we should take seriously.
Okay. Like, where do you think that manifests? Like, some will tell me it's at the university, and I can't see that that's true. I mean, in every way, it seems like if you were applying to college, you're going to actually do or land a better position or have a better chance of getting in with 900 SATs, 1300 SATs, if you are a Black American.
Well, and you want to talk about real systemic racism in that story, the whole story about Harvard University and Asian Americans, that's the real scandal, which is that particular groups are overperforming and they're punished for it. And we have the evidence now from Harvard University that they were using something, a personality metric, to deny Asian applicants on the basis of their race. And for the sake of affirmative action, people said, no, we need to defend it.
Yeah.
It's the same way that Harvard kept out qualified Jews in the early 20th century. And it's just funny because we're living with, there's no clear example of systemic racism in this, and yet progressives are sort of fine with it. They sort of call it defensible.
Yeah. The one piece that I might call systemic racism in this, that I don't think that people would usually call it this, is Heather McDonald's point and the research that she's done on mismatch theory. That when you do have a kid that's getting out of a pretty tough area with 1,300 SATs, he probably belongs at a place like Stanford or Notre Dame, but instead gets put in Harvard or MIT, finishes in the lower part of his class because instead of being with his peer group of the top 5%, he's now in with the 0.1%. And they get a lower PhDs, they drop out of STEM majors and get into something else. When he could have graduated with Notre Dame with honors, which is a good school, and been a successful engineer. Like that how is that not systemic racism? That's working. I want to help Black people. I don't want to guilt white people. I actually want to help Black people.
Yeah, I think Coleman Hughes and some others have I think the solution to this has been known for a long time, which is just you have to do affirmative action by a socioeconomic cutoff. Because there is something to be said for helping people that have come from lower means, but doing it by socioeconomics makes it fair.
Yeah.
And it's still going to disproportionately help Black and brown people. There is something to be said for, I was able to go to good schools because I was born in a house that really valued education. My parents were both employed. They were both at home. There is something to be said for that. And the kids who can overcome that in spite of all that should be rewarded. But should it be on the basis of race? I mean, I'll be honest with you. In the Ivy League, most of the students of color I met, their parents were doctors and they went to fancier private schools than I did. Not saying they didn't deserve to be there. Many of them were Nigerian. I can think of one person in particular who was the daughter of a Nigerian poetry professor at another major university.
He emailed me once, I think. I'm kidding.
What?
I said that guy emailed me once, I think.
Well, it'd be better to get poetry in your email than an inheritance that's not actually yours.
Okay, so he wasn't a prince. Okay.
Right. No, the question is not did she deserve to be there. She was a brilliant girl. But the question is that who affirmative action is designed to help? And I would say probably no, even though she's a person of color.
Right.
But I was having a discussion with someone about this, which is it is still true that the biggest privilege you can have is being born into a family with educated parents that value education, regardless of where you start off. And What is really going to overcome these disparities? We have to be honest about that. And I feel like that's one problem, is that we've made the cultural discussion somewhat taboo. I'm sure you've read Thomas Sowell's Black Rednecks and White Liberals.
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
That's a great book.
I mean, it's a great book. And the basic thesis, which is that both on the lower socioeconomic scale, people of all races are suffering because of the same cultural inheritance that was brought from Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, and then forced upon many black people in slavery. It's pretty compelling. And it's part of the reason why a lot of black immigrants come here and do amazingly well, although they also suffer from racism. I mean, these immigrants, they'll be pulled over by the cops in ways that probably you and I won't. We should still recognize that as a problem, but they're still successful in America. And I worry that if we blame it all on systemic racism, again, we should eliminate it anyway. Asian Americans are doing incredibly. But we have to be really honest, again, in this way, like an engineer, in terms of how do some people succeed and others fail. But that's not a substitute for, should the police be able to harm people in this way? Is there a problem when there's a sentencing disparity between a white defendant and a black defendant? These are all worth talking about. Mm-hmm. But are we living in the Jim Crow South? No. In fact, we've made unbelievable progress.
Right. So yeah, with some of the hyperbole and some of the politicking can get out. You're right. We might come to solutions on this. I want to get over to the shutdown stem. See, I think some of the hyperbole and the pieces like that are starting to wig people out, myself included. And somebody in the chat said it's my Notre Dame bias. Yes, it is. LOL. That was a good one. What is shutdown stem? You linked to a Nature article in a tweet, and I read it, and I was like, holy bleep.
Yeah, shutdown STEM. I got into a big discussion with Ali Rizvi about this. He was saying it's no big deal. It's just, they're taking a day off to talk about racism. But of course, what are they going to talk about? Anti-Semitism? Of course they're not. Are they going to talk about racism against the groups that are overrepresented in STEM? Like, again, Asian Americans and South Asian Americans? No, it's a particular narrative about, well, certain groups aren't in this profession because they've been oppressed and there is systemic racism against them today. And again, the academy is probably one of the least racist places on the face of the planet that has ever existed. It's not perfect, but, I sort of liken it to, what if intelligent design had successfully gotten into our science classrooms, right? Because you might say, oh, it's an innocent thing. They're talking about racial bias. How could that harm anybody? Well, it's a particular ideology that just keeps. And as you say, does it belong there? You might say, oh, well, what's wrong with hearing alternatives to the Big Bang Theory? Isn't science about considering alternatives? Or is it an ideology trying to assert its place against science, where science encroaches on its beliefs? And I do think there's a problem with that. I'm sure you've seen what J.K. Rowling has been going through recently.
Yeah, she's been going through a struggle session of sorts.
Yeah, as someone put it, and now Daniel Radcliffe has to sort of explain it away. As someone put it, Daniel Radcliffe explaining to J.K. Rowling what makes a woman. That's 2020 in a nutshell right there. Should we be able to discuss the biology of these things? Yes. Should we be sensitive to the people involved? Absolutely. But to make it something where we can't even discuss it is a problem. This isn't something I talk about a lot because, I think whether it's about, trans athletes, I mean, it's really not a mortal threat to civilization. And I think the sports leagues should work it out for themselves. But we should be able to discuss these things honestly and compassionately. And the problem with this ideology encroaching is that it makes it harder and harder to do that and find real solutions.
Yeah. I guess the first thing that bothered me with the shutdown STEM, that take a day off to discuss racial issues, was I remember a college somewhere out in the Northwest that an entire incident that devolved into chaos started over this same thing, right? It immediately reminded me of Evergreen, except for everywhere. And I guess what was a little nutty was what you linked into the Nature article. So this is Nature. It's a scientific magazine that is publishing under their editorial. And here's what they say. We recognize that nature, is one of the white institutions that is responsible for bias in research and scholarship. The enterprise of science has been and remains complicit in systemic racism, and we must strive harder to correct those injustices and amplify the marginalized voices. I mean, I could publish the Apostles' Creed in Nature as well, and it doesn't make it any more true. I mean, they give no evidence for any of the things that they cite in here. It's just, this is what we believe.
Correct. And they could have studied this in a scientific way, and it would have been interesting. They could have just said, well, is there racial bias in science? I think that would be the appropriate response, and to look at the data. To assume that it's true, as you say, without giving any evidence, well, again, this is where this ideology, I mean, this sort of woke ideology doesn't even ask the question, is it true and to what extent?
Yeah.
You know, and right now, I remember there was a paper published a couple of years ago that showed, for example, that when it comes to hiring in scientific positions, you absolutely do have an advantage if you're a woman. I'm not saying that to complain. Great, we need more women scientists. But to therefore say it's this racist, sexist, deplorable institution, well, where is the evidence? And that's, again, where, you know, saying we're going to take a day off to talk about it, well, is it a problem? You know, do you take a day off to give yourself chemotherapy if you don't need it? No, you have to first diagnose what the problem is. Do you even need chemotherapy? Chemotherapy is really strong stuff. Not to mention, there's research that shows a lot of this anti-bias training doesn't work.
Right.
That's one of the reasons that after the big kerfuffle with James Damore, Google actually got rid of a lot of its earlier programs because they found it wasn't really achieving their goal, and it was causing internal strife in the company. It was dividing people further. It gave evidence that they were biased against other sections of people. So, you know, there isn't enough of a talk about, if your goal is to increase the diversity or increase the awareness of diversity in your company, what's really going to create more harmony among different groups of people, and to approach it dispassionately and test things out. These people know what the answer is. Again, despite the fact that the evidence is not good that it works. I know what's the implicit bias test, is that the IAT?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, even the creators admit that it doesn't work. You know, it's part of the big replication crisis in psychology, and yet people assert that that's what you do. Another sort of tangential example of this is sending alcoholics to Alcoholics Anonymous. They finally have some science in Alcoholics Anonymous, and the science is not very good in terms of, did this get people who were alcoholics to quit being alcoholics? Again, I've known severe alcoholics, that people that couldn't show up to work, they'd be at the bar at 9 a.m. And for some it was helpful, and others it wasn't. And when it wasn't helpful, they blamed them. They said, well, it's actually your fault. And imagine a doctor blaming a patient for the treatment not working versus, okay, we've got to try something else. Yeah. So in terms of making a workplace we really, again, have to just be married to this data-driven approach. And it is interesting to watch people that agree with that 90% of the time give in to this sort of hunch the other 10% of the time only on these issues.
Yeah.
Like, for example, I've seen people that absolutely put not their faith, that's the wrong quote, but they put their trust in science because science shows where it does better than other methods. But for example, they will completely dismiss evolutionary psychology, just completely out of hand, completely dismiss it. Evolutionary psychology is definitely soft. There are definitely people who claim there are conclusions that aren't really there, that are driven by bias, and we should talk about that. But the question is, in terms of understanding how the human brain works, what's the better alternative? And it's always something that an activist said, which of course, you know, this is a conspiracy of the patriarchy. This is a conspiracy of the white supremacist such and such versus
yeah, the boogeyman too. You have evolutionary psychology. It's considered right wing and pseudoscience and all of this. But how on the spot is anthropology? Again, sometimes you're making leaps, and sometimes you get to something good, and other times it's wild conjecture. You would see the same thing with the social sciences. We have a huge replication problem in this. That doesn't mean we get rid of them. That means we try to do better. So, I mean, if they want to say, hey, evolutionary psychology needs to get more rigorous, they need to do X, Y, and Z, and they have a path forward for them, yeah, fine. But yeah, they cancel it. When I read this, this sounds like something that I might say if ISIS has a sword to my throat. You know, you'll try to say anything to save your life. None of this seems scientific. All of this seems like, oh my God, you'd better do this because the mob is coming, and this is the blood over your door to make sure the angel of death doesn't get you.
Yeah, I would say it's probably, comparing it to ISIS. Maybe it's not quite that bad, but I get what you're saying though. It's when it doesn't fit the ideological conclusions. I mean, imagine if there was a study in evolutionary psychology that proved that, as it turns out, women were better than men overall in mathematics. People would say, "Look, it's science.
Yeah.
Science says women are better in mathematics." Now, maybe it would say that. It's only when it's not ideologically convenient. Again, a lot of the ideological aims are ones that I share. I mean, you want everybody to have access to any of the fields that they're talented at and want to do. But this whole idea that, well, because there's a disparity, this is evidence of oppression, that's where it jumps the shark.
Yeah.
I think probably not that long ago, only a couple decades ago, that was certainly more true. But is it true now? And of course, I'm sure you've seen that study that showed that there are more women in STEM the more patriarchal the country is. Like you have more women in STEM in countries like India and Iran, and it's countries like Sweden where they have fewer women in STEM, because what they find is that as countries get freer and more wealthy, women make different choices than men.
Yeah.
And to whatever extent, suppose there's a woman in Sweden that desperately wanted to be a computer programmer and these terrible men kept her out. I mean, that's terrible. That's a crime. But is that the overall reason for the disparity? Not necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Is that evidence of oppression? Not necessarily. That being said, we should do everything we can to encourage women to enter the field anyway.
Yeah. And you see, why do we see more black professional athletes? But my guess is that there's so many that want to do this that they've created a culture of excellence that's incredible, right? They're all pushing each other so hard because they see themselves as this athlete. So your crop of people to pick from are better trained, know that they're smarter, right? They're just better. And I think that's why there's more. I don't think that there's anything genetic about it. I think that they've pushed themselves to a culture of excellence in this area, but maybe not so much in other fields. But that's why you're seeing that.
Right. And when it's not ideologically inconvenient, why aren't there more Jews in the NBA? Well, is that evidence that there's anti-Semitism in the NBA? No. I mean, there are some. There was that the football player for the Patriots, Edelman. There are some, but there aren't so many. But is that evidence that there's an anti-Semitic conspiracy in professional sports? I mean, I just don't see it. And nobody else sees it either. People would call you ridiculous for saying that. So rightfully so. I mean, where's the evidence for it? There just isn't any. Where someone who was Jewish and athletically talented showed up to tryouts and tried to get an agent, and they said, no, we don't accept your kind here. It just doesn't happen now. It doesn't happen in the 21st century.
Yeah, that's a good point. Quick super chat. Miles Kinslow says, hey, guys, good conversation. Brian, thanks for the follow. Also, a YouTuber named Karlin Borinsenko, if I got that right, an organizational psychologist, would be a great interview. Sean, let's mark that down. Thanks for the super chat, Miles. But yeah, all of this, I work a lot of times in medicine and go to high-level conferences where you see the best of the best doctors talking about different issues. And they'll present a case study, and they'll say, they'll show a patient, and they'll do all this stuff, and they're like, so would you operate on this? And the guy from the Cleveland Clinic's like, nah, no way. And the woman from the University of Chicago is like, yeah, I definitely would. And it's weird. They don't shame each other for the choices. They listen to each other, and someone's like, that's interesting. And the other guy says, oh, that's interesting. And they just try to take the best. That sometimes there isn't a consensus. And I feel like anytime politics gets into science, always bad things result. I think this is exactly what happened with COVID, that there can be only one narrative, that there can't be multiple scientific opinions that are kind of equally valid, because guess what? It's a novel coronavirus. We don't know anything about it. So, I mean, you agree? Like, anytime politics gets in, it seems like science is, I don't know, that gets beaten up.
Well, you can't do good science if you're making moral judgments about it when you're investigating it. You have to investigate it as dispassionately as you can. People assert, of course, that's not possible. People assert, there's only bias, and you're going to come in it with your bias. You can't possibly examine it. You can't possibly account for it. To me, this is where I'm sort of over this. This idea that science can understand the structure of the atom, but it just can't see whether or not it's discriminating against someone on the basis of skin color. I just don't buy it. I mean, of course, we all have our biases, and of course, we have to work hard to overcome them. But it's something that can be overcome to a large degree. And you're right. Like, there's no moral position on how to cure a tumor. It's not like, well, this, how do I say that? Maybe that's inaccurate. Of course, there are consider. It's kind of like how, remember that conversation between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson about whether you knew the structure of a virus, and whether you know the structure of the virus is totally different from whether it's wise to create the virus because it would kill mankind. And Jordan Peterson was saying, well, no, clearly that's wrong, as in not just morally wrong, but factually wrong. In other words, it wasn't true because it led to widespread death. Versus if you want to beat the virus, you have to understand it. How are you going to understand it? If you attach morals to how this thing is structured and how it interacts with the body, you're never going to solve it. And yeah, politics, when you put politics into it, it takes a stance before it even knows fully what it's looking at and knows fully what to do about it.
Yeah.
So you're right. I mean, this is why having it infringe on the scientific process is dangerous. It should be the other way around. We should have science infringe on the political process. That's really what we should have happen.
Yeah.
If we had a group of engineers to try to, well, how do we fix this problem of And I think that's what people like Bill Gates and Andrew Yang are trying to do. I really do. I think they're trying as best they can to apply that ethos to solving other types of problems.
Okay, makes sense. What do you say, like, as to wrap up? Like, there's a lot of people kind of freaking out right now because you see somebody getting pushed out of Major League Soccer for something their wife did, a teacher supporting Donald Trump and whatever tweet back and now being put on leave. You see this thing with the stem. You see people kneeling that you didn't expect. There's a lot of people that are freaked out. What would you say?
Right now, just, if you're worried about posting something, don't do it. That's probably the best advice. It's terrible to say that, right? Because it's an incredibly oppressive. I don't want to say oppressive. It's like, it's not like anything that. But definitely, I would say just be overly cautious right now, because honestly, a lot of it is that the weather's getting warmer. People are unemployed. People are stuck at home. I've seen this with friends of mine back home, where even the most innocuous statements are being taken in ways you just couldn't imagine. So it's hard out there. If you have, unlike the president, if you have a home committee to scrutinize everything you post, get one. Because it's going to be like this, I think, at least until the weather gets a little cooler, or when employment's better, or when the virus is better maintained.
Okay, yeah. Speaking about when it's getting warmer, on August 16th of this year, we are holding our Better Discourse event. We moved that. It was supposed to be on July 11th, but it is now August 16th, where we're bringing in a range of viewpoints to talk about a range of different subjects, some of which are actually going to switch because we didn't anticipate coronavirus. We didn't anticipate George Floyd, all this stuff. So we're going to have a big announcement on a speaker that we are, looks like we've confirmed, but we're in the final process of that, so we can't announce quite yet, but that should be exciting. That'll be fun. So if you can make it and you're willing to, August 16th in Milwaukee for a Better Discourse. And really, really appreciate your time today. Like, it's great to talk to you. I think you've calmed me down a little bit. That's for sure. It's just, man, things are at a fever pitch, Lucas. So when I see some of these happening, I'm just like, oh man, we're in big trouble. It's interesting to, I just get a bunch of different perspectives.
It's good to put on I call it a pinker hat. It's good to put on the hat, tone it down, and just look at the data and see what's really going on. He really changed my worldview in terms of what the journalism is telling you. They're hyping everybody up, and it's made worse by social media. So just putting the hat on and seeing what's really going on, I find, is just really, really useful.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, definitely we want to talk to you again. Really appreciate it. Love the Twitter account. You should definitely check him out, Lucas Lynch on Twitter. And it is. Yep, Lucas Lynch, all one word. Is there a J in there?
There's a J, yeah.
I'm so sorry. Lucas J. Lynch. Somebody needs glasses. Lucas J. Lynch on Twitter. Really good stuff. I absolutely loved that tweet about, again, this religion is successfully taking over the sciences in a way that intelligent design could only ever dream of. That's brilliant. I wish I could tweet like that. I hope to talk to you again. Thanks, Lucas.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, look.